Kerbal Space Program. Is this simulator game out of this world, or does it blow up before getting off the ground? Will it make you feel like an astronaut, or make you want to launch it into the sun?
I'm gonna put some dirt in your eye. How'd that get in there?
Stick around if you're interested in finding out if this game is worth your time and money. We've played it so you don't have to. My name's Dan and welcome to D&D Gaming. Joining me in the review as always is my brother Dav. So Dav, what were your expectations before playing this one?
Well, I've played this briefly before, but not really fully gotten into it. I bought it some years ago on Steam, played about with it, but didn't quite commit myself to it fully, so it's been good to get a better grip on it.
As for me, I've heard a lot of good things about this game over the years, and so had quite high expectations going into it. I did have a good idea of what it would be about though, and so it wasn't a complete surprise.
So starting with the graphic options, there's quite an extensive range of graphic settings to play around with, including render quality, text quality, and terrain shader quality, alongside the usual anti-aliasing and VSync options. One thing I did find here was that the game didn't detect my screen resolution, so I did have to adjust this manually, along with adjusting to full screen mode rather than windowed mode that the game started in. No biggie, but it's worth noting as it may happen to others.
Yeah, there's a decent range of graphic options to tweak, although I mostly left these untouched, as it seemed to auto-detect mine without any issues.
So in terms of graphics and graphics performance, our PC specs are up on screen as usual, but the game ran well on my PC. I ran the game with everything on the highest quality settings and didn't notice any major graphical issues. The graphics are very basic in this, so I didn't imagine it being very taxing on my system, and I don't think it's worth digging any further into the graphics side, as they are pretty basic. I think the developers concentrated on the physics, mechanics and science background to the game rather than graphics, which is fair enough considering the game's purpose as a spacecraft building and flying simulation game.
I left mine on the default settings and it ran well with no noticeable issues. The graphic style is quite basic, but I kind of expected it as it does have a lot to process in terms of physics and stuff you don't see, so this wasn't an issue for me. This is also quite an old game now, with the first initial public access being way back in 2011, so I wasn't expecting the latest graphics. They're decent enough for its age though, and do the job for the style of game that it is.
So in terms of player controls, the controls are pretty extensive in this game and they can be rebound in the settings menu. There's tons of customization to the controls, and the controls vary wildly depending on whether you're building a spaceship, flying an atmosphere, flying in orbit of a celestial body, or flying across empty space. The type of ship and its setup will also affect the control options and availability of certain functions too.
Not much to add to that, but there is a lot of customization in the settings menu, with sensitivity and dead zones that can be tweaked, and more than you get in your average game for sure.
So in terms of game modes, there's the main career mode along with an extensive training mode. The training mode, which is highly recommended you go through before playing, goes into each and every scenario from the basics and advanced building of your craft, piloting in low and high orbit, and transferring between planets amongst many more. This game is deep when it comes to the science and engineering behind spaceflight. In career mode, you're given your very own space center to run on the planet Kerbin. You start your career by simply building and launching craft as part of your space program, and gradually build up your equipment to build and fly more complex spacecraft. You can complete contracts in career mode, which give you funds to continue to build your program.
There's also a science game mode, which apparently simplifies some stuff and is aimed at beginners who find the main career mode overwhelming, and also a sandbox mode, which has no limitations and unlimited parts available to really go crazy with the spacecraft projects. There are also scenarios which simulate real-world space missions and ESA missions. 2 DLC have also been released, making history in 2018 and breaking ground in 2019.
So in terms of game mechanics, from the Space Center map mode in career mode, you get a bird's eye view of your entire space center. There's the research building for researching more complex spacecraft components, an astronaut complex where your pilots, all with the last name Kerman, hang out, and of course the vehicle assembly building and launch pad where you build and launch craft from. Most of your time will be spent in the vehicle assembly building, crafting your space rocket designs. Or if you're anything like me, you'll be revisiting to attach a parachute, which you forgot to attach the first time. You use the game's build functions to build your craft piece by piece. There are endless possibilities here, only held back by the limiting component choice early in the game, and as many elements such as weight, counterbalance and aerodynamics will have a major factor in how your craft launches and controls, it's well worth going through the training as mentioned earlier to fully understand the impact components will have and their uses. For example, solid fuel rockets will launch you up through planet Kerbin's atmosphere, but will not work once you're in orbit. So therefore it's pointless building a fully solid fueled rocket with no engines that will work in orbit. The training will ensure you don't waste hours building rockets that won't fly, unless that floats your boat. You can build rockets that's purpose are to simply reach low Kerbal orbit, high Kerbal orbit, or rockets designed to be powerful enough to reach other celestial bodies such as the Mun, Kerbin's equivalent of the Moon. From here you can explore the rest of the solar system. Once your rocket is built, you can name it, save it, launch it, and hope for the best.
After launch and whilst in flight, you can control the stages of your rocket and how this takes place. There's quite a lot to do, keeping an eye on your craft's instruments in the UI, and you're given full control over every aspect of the flight. No cutscenes where the game takes control from you here. You can engage with science experiments whilst in space if you have added these to your craft, and either send back the data to the space center or land safely back to the planet with the experiment intact. Easier said than done. You earn science points for well executed and surviving experiments. Once you either crash land or land as gently as a feather if you're skilled or lucky, you can either get out and explore with your Kerbal pilot, or if you're landed back on Kerbin, you can recover the craft back to the space center and reuse the parts for your next craft. If you crash landed, you get a log detailing what went wrong. Once back in the space center, you get a screen detailing your flight and how much science and XP you and your pilot have gained. Science can then be spent in the research center to upgrade.
So in terms of UI, this is very extensive and varies substantially dependent on the mechanics of the part of the game you're in. If you're in the Space Center map mode, you have icons to the left of the screen that allow you to enter the various parts of the Space Center. Icons to the top of the screen refer to your funds available and science points gained. To the bottom right are menu icons for the game's built-in manual and career contracts menu, amongst others. If you're building your craft, the rocket part categories fill a column to the left of the screen from which the various parts can be selected from. Your available funds and the cost of your current build are shown in the bottom left. There are also icons in the bottom right which detail the stages of the craft, and the menu icons detailing the engineering and science behind the craft you're building. Top right has icons for saving, launching and leaving, amongst others. If you're in flight mode, the UI is broken up into instrument clusters that detail every aspect of your craft. Surrounding environment from your atmospheric pressure to speed, direction including yaw, pitch and roll, G-force and fuel, amongst many more. The navbar is particularly helpful as this not only indicates your angle of direction, but also any mission markers or prompts are indicated on here by varying range of marker styles and colours, all of which are covered in the training. Although the control system is very extensive, the UI is generally well laid out considering the amount of information it has to contain. It doesn't clutter the screen too much, icons are about the right size, and it doesn't get in the way too much.
I thought the UI was very detailed and will take some time to familiarise yourself with. I didn't necessarily find it overwhelming though, and given how complex the game is, I think they did a great job here. As with any simulation game like this, it's a good idea to just pause early on and get to grips with where everything is, but the training missions also really help here. As you'd expect, you can also hover over anything on the UI if you're unsure what it does. For me, the only part that really took some time to get used to was the navbar, as it has a ton of different icons and markers on it. But again, the training missions will help you here, and so they introduce these throughout the various training missions. So in terms of the sound and music, the limited music is okay and certainly doesn't stand out in a bad way, but I do think this is an area that could be improved. I found sometimes when exiting a planet, there'd be some nice ambient back... What was that?
That was my stomach.
Boy, it's a fart.
What? I didn't do anything. Oh my God. No. Hey. Don't do that. No, come on. Hey. Oh, man. Oh, it's in my mouth.
I found sometimes when exiting a planet, there'd be some nice ambient background music, and then it would suddenly stop dead and be silent once you got out of the atmosphere, instead of transitioning to a different style. The ambient sounds were fine though, such as when in the vehicle assembly building.
Yeah, so for me in terms of the music, as Dale's pointed out, it is generally limited and mainly focused around the crafting in the hangar, which is very generic and quite repetitive to say the least. There's a bit of music used to indicate reaching the planet's orbit, but this is even more limited and is not much more than a series of combined sounds, really. The lack of music, though, did mean the environment sounds were more noticeable. These are generally pretty good, nothing stood out to be great, but not particularly bad either. There's no voice acting in the game, as the Hohmann characters that run you through the tutorial and those that you send up into space simply make odd noises, and you have to read what they are instructing you in the training on screen.
In terms of bugs and glitches, I didn't notice any major bugs, although when following the training missions, there were a couple of points where I just couldn't progress to the next part of the tutorial, and the next button was blanked out, even though I had done everything I needed on that page. I had this a couple of times and had to restart the training and try things a little different before it would let me progress. I'm sure this wasn't just me missing something and took a little bit of trial and error, which was a shame. This wasn't too major of an issue, but it was a bit frustrating having to restart the whole mission again when this happened. I can't say for sure if this was a bug, but it certainly stood out as one to me.
So for me, I didn't get any major or game-breaking bugs. The occasional clipping of the camera through surfaces kind of thing, but nothing was worse than that. So to sum up, things I liked about the game, I think it's quite a unique game. I've not come across a space program crafting game before, and I'm not aware that any others with a similar format actually exist. The game is deep. I'm a keen space fan and I do have an interest in space science and technology, so it's really good to see that this game is so deep when it comes to this. It doesn't just scratch the surface and throw cutscenes in your face every time a maneuver takes place, as with some games. In this, you control pretty much everything. For example, to transition between a planet's orbit and the orbit of the Mun, the game's moon, you do have to plan your transfer using the apoapsis and periapsis of your orbit. This is the highest and lowest points of your orbit respectively. You can plan this by putting markers at these points of your orbit in space map mode and adjust your exit or entry trajectory and angle, and the game works out the engine burn time required to execute the maneuver and whether you need to burn in prograde, facing the way you're orbiting to speed up, or retrograde, burning against the orbit direction to slow down. It's all pretty complex at first, but the training does help to get your head around it, although in many cases this still didn't help me improve my landings. Although it's a long training program, the scenarios do really help you to understand the various aspects of spaceflight, the various craft, staging, orbiting, transferring and landing. The UI, especially in the flight mode, is really well implemented, considering the number of functions the game has. It's all well set up and laid out in the UI instrumentation. When you manage to execute a well-planned launch, orbit, spaceflight and landing, I found it to be very rewarding, largely because the game is so difficult, so overcoming this in itself is the reward.
In terms of things I liked, well, it is a very deep game and one you could really put thousands of hours into. The game's solar system is loosely based on our real world solar system, and so there really is a lot to explore. The sandbox mode lets you go crazy with trying different spacecraft designs, and you really have a lot to have fun with in this. There's a huge amount of replayability, as even once you're through the career mode, there's still a science mode and sandbox mode, along with the scenarios and ESA missions. It really is a huge game with lots to do. It is a complex game at times and certainly had me scratching my head and reading over again, but that also leads to it being very satisfying, such as when you first get into orbit or land on the moon. There's also a huge amount of community support, and I did watch a couple of YouTube tutorials that people had made to help with the more complex stuff, such as executing certain maneuvers. It's the sort of game that feels like you're actually learning something, as it definitely has a serious undertone, but also has lots of humour to make it more accessible. There is the thorough training tutorial, which covers the basics very well and also goes on to the more complex stuff, although it did leave a little to be desired for me.
So in terms of things I didn't like about the game, I said on my likes it's rewarding, and the game really is, but as this is largely due to its challenging and complex difficulty, even on the most basic of difficulty settings, the game can be really hard to get your head around and will take a lot of practice and some trial and error too. Its difficulty can lead to frustration, as the smallest miscalculation in a staging or landing sequence can end in disaster, and ultimately getting annoyed with the game is easy. I nearly rage quit a couple of times following tiny mistakes I'd made that had big consequences on my spaceflight sequencing. It could be very unforgiving, but then I suppose space is.
In terms of things I didn't like, as I mentioned earlier, a couple of the training missions can be a little bit frustrating at times to move through the stages and needed a bit too much trial and error. I think these could be reviewed and tweaked a little to make them easier to follow. The complexity of the game can leave you a little baffled at times, so you really have to be in the mood to sit down and really stick with it. It's not necessarily the sort of game you can relax to, certainly not early on when trying to get to grips with it anyway. So Dav, did you think there were any missed opportunities?
I think this game could be amazing with better graphics and a more realistic human element. I get why they went with the funny alien direction to have a wider appeal further than just the science gaming community, but I think the game would be better if more focused on real-world human space program expansion. A game where you could build a space program to rival Musk and SpaceX would be cool. So in terms of scores, what do you think on this one, Dale?
Well, to sum up, this is an excellent game for anyone interested in space exploration or physics-based simulation games. The game's realistic physics engine and in-depth tutorials make it a great way to learn about orbital mechanics, rocket propulsion and other aspects of space travel. It's challenging, rewarding and replayable, and you get a lot of game for your money. This one is definitely worth checking out, and so it's an 8 out of 10 from me.
If, like me, you like space science and technology and want that combined into a computer game, then you can't go far wrong with Kerbal Space Program. Its deep space tech functions and realistic spaceflight mechanics will keep you playing for hours. However, even with its humorous alien race setting, this game doesn't really appeal to the masses, as its depth of complexity will be too much for some. Personally, I really like the game, and I think it's the early basis and influence of what will likely be more complex, realistic space building and flight sims in the future. For example, imagine combining the complexity of Kerbal Space Program's deep space flight and landing mechanics, controlled by you as the player, not the game, with the graphics, realism and exploration of games such as No Man's Sky, Elite Dangerous or Star Citizen. I don't think it will be long before a game manages to combine the best parts of all these games into one, possibly Starfield? I digress. Back to Kerbal Space Program scoring. It's a recommendation to play this game from me, and a high score of 7.5 out of 10.
Well guys, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe and comment. Hit that bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video, and we'll see you in the next one.